Hi, everybody. Can you hear me all right? Okay, so the first thing that I'm going to be talking about is what's a Dutchirican? So the Pennsylvania Dutch country stretches from Allentown in the northeast down to basically York in the southwest. And the first place of contact in a major way, Beatrice Ramirez was talking about in Allentown and said, if you imagine your typical Pennsylvania Dutch or your Dutchie talking to your typical Puerto Rican, the Puerto Rican is moving forward and the Dutchman is moving backwards, right? By basically trying to stay away. And so he's saying that these are two, or as one person said to me, God really had a sense of humor putting these two groups together in such close proximity. And then you get down to here to Pedro Cruz, who says, no, you know, he's a Nuyorican, he's from New York, he was born and raised there, moved to Lebanon, now he's a elementary school principal. And the way he says, linguistically, culturally, and in a variety of ways, he's been changed by living out in the Pennsylvania Dutch region. So when he says, yeah, I'm a Dutchirican, so that's where we got the idea for this, for our exhibit. Some background information is that before 1970, if you talked about people who spoke Spanish or what now we would describe as Hispanic, you're mainly talking about Philadelphia or Philadelphia County, right? 70% of all people who today we would describe as Hispanic or Latino lived in Philadelphia or its immediate environs. That has really shifted so that there's about as many that live in the Pennsylvania Dutch countryside, and if you include the anthracite coal region up, like in Scranton, Wilkes-Barre, there's more that live outside of Philadelphia than inside. So the population is really ruralizing, or at least moving to smaller cities. You know, and again, most people are going to be aware that most of that migration pattern tends to go from New York, New Jersey, and bypasses Philadelphia and go out to the countryside. So because of the nature of either born in the US or Puerto Rican, they are overwhelmingly US citizens. Most of them speak, or at least most speak Spanish at home, but a third speak English as their first language. And part of the way I got interested in the topic is there's some interesting regional variations in terms of how likely people are to be Protestants or Catholics. And then they tend to be people who just intermarry more. They marry someone from outside their group as any other racial or ethnic group in the country. So the idea that Puerto Ricans or Dominicans would come to the area and not interact with other people, or that everybody would stay in hermetically sealed isolation, is part of what we're kind of exploding. So the other way to look at it is Pennsylvania has the 4th largest Puerto Rican population in the country, and it tends to be understudied. Again, you know, to the extent that there is a history in the state, it tends to be about Philadelphia, and so we're trying to include this area here, the Pennsylvania Dutch countryside. Okay, a big reason why people are moving to towns like Lebanon, Lancaster, is because of housing. And just housing in New York City, I don't know if anyone's found this out, but it's a little expensive, and that it's not that there's a lot economically going on in towns like Lebanon, but there's enough, right? There's warehouses, there's other kinds of facilities, and so you can make 10 or 11 bucks in New York City, but it just goes a lot further out in the countryside. So what lots of people told us, and then also what we've read in interviews or newspaper accounts, is that what people are looking for is a kind of high quality of life. Often it's about medicine or education, and so that is part of what's driving things. So again, it's a little different than the idea that it's either about jobs, the idea that people are migrating because this is a town that's booming. So again, as a historian, our older notion is that you build factories, and the factories are, attract people from around the world, and that's what brings Pennsylvania's ethnic diversity. So that sort of notion is kind of different than what we're seeing. So the the background, the kind of first large-scale movement of people from Puerto Rico to the region came as tomato or tomateros, or people who worked in agriculture. So they were basically during World War II, Puerto Rico became an important source of labor for this region and for the Pennsylvania, and then as well, canning tomatoes became an important source of revenue for small-scale farmers in the Lancaster area, right? So this was a cash crop that they could make good money for, and their big shortcoming was if you could raise 1 to 5 acres just with family labor, but if you wanted to get any bigger than that and make more money, you had to hire seasonal workers. So they needed people who, and I'm sorry this didn't come out quite as well, but to find somebody who could pick tomatoes, any of us could pick tomatoes, right? But you had to be able to pick them while they were ripe but green. So you needed somebody who knew something about this and was willing to do fairly intensive stoop labor. So it was both physically demanding but also highly skilled. And so in the course of a day, you might pick 200 of these if you were really good and you really knew what you were doing. You could pick 200 of these and make about the equivalent of $200, which for Puerto Rican migrants coming from the Central Highlands, often in Puerto Rico, that was worth coming for. And the trade-off for farmers was they got paid by the quality of the tomato that was picked, right? So if you just picked any tomato, you did not get paid as much. So farmers and Puerto Rican migrants had a shared interest. So here you see some sort of evidence of this. This is from the Hess family. Joanne Segrist Hess made this available to the Lancaster Mennonite Historical Society, which is where we did a lot of our research. But you start to see some of the conditions that people are living in, that the housing was really ad hoc. The populations were really more diverse than Pennsylvania or central Pennsylvania was used to. This is just from a 1950s newspaper. So what you start to see is that early on, at least in Lancaster, you start to see that a lot of the Mennonite farmers wanted to evangelize with the Puerto Ricans who were there. And so the idea that they promoted is that basically friends in the field became brothers in the church, right? And there's a interesting discussion about this. So this is from Christianity Today, basically showing, here you see the tomatero talking to the Mennonite farmer. Here they are in church, they're very pious. This is probably, there's one of the first churches of the Rollinsville Church was where farmers would essentially kind of, I don't want to say round up, but they basically would round up their migrants on a Sunday and hold a big kind of revival style meeting. And this started to have some effect, and then fairly early on, the thing that Mennonite evangelicals realized, or Mennonite ministers realized, is if you only have individuals, you can't really keep them in the church. Because for one thing, they're only there for part of the time, but the other is that you can imagine these are men far away from home. They are, the temptation to sin is fairly high. So for a variety of reasons, the Mennonite ministers and sort of some of the people leading this outreach started to realize we need families to join. If we can get a family to join, then they're much more likely to stay in the church. And so these are just some of the depictions of these tomateros basically with other people's children, right? And these are some of the earliest images we have. And so it suggests there is a kind of familial connection coming along. But again, if housing is what's bringing people here, the housing is a major contradiction. There really is some truth to what Beatriz Ramirez is talking about. At this point in time, farmers loved Puerto Rican pickers, right? They recognize these guys work hard, they're really skilled, they know what they're doing. The problem is nobody wanted them living in their area, right? Living in the back of your farm, that's okay, right? But they're living in these kind of conditions, but on a permanent basis, no, right? So this is this sort of, the tomateros were living this kind of, really kind of very sad existence. I mean, in one case, there's a guy who died while he was here, and the Puerto Rican farm labor program basically did an inventory of what was in one of these suitcases, and the answer was like almost nothing, right? There was a change of clothes, a comb, some pomade, a hat. But these are really, really poor men coming and really trying to make as much money as possible to go back to Puerto Rico. So what you see here is in this transition period from a migratory population to a full-time one, is some farmers, and in this case it was a Mennonite family who basically adopted a tomatero and then provided housing for him in a chicken house behind their place. And so the relationships between these families were super close, but you could also see that there's some minor differences between the housing styles that were afforded. So this was basically, but this was a good house in that temporary period. And this is Shirley Bell, which is the name of it's the nom de plume of the woman who kind of wrote this account. She's talking about, this is they used to call this the Puerto Rican house, and now she's saying, no, let's give it a new name for Luis is bringing his family, so let's call it the Faith House. And so the Faith Cottage is a good name. We all must remember we have a mission field right at our front door. Let's do what we can to let our light shine for Jesus. We want Rosa to feel at home here. And so this is a very kind of one interpretation. They hung drapes, they made it as homey as they could. This is the woman, as it turns out, because this is the woman the daughter of the tomatero who lived in that house has given her own account, and this is written by the guy who's it wasn't of that structure, but it's inside another chicken house, and he's basically, inside the barn, he wrote basically this kind of cry that as a historian I find very compelling. He's basically saying, remember us. Remember, it says literally, remember of Pedro Ventura, 1955. But basically, it's a cry to say, we were here, we contributed, we were voiceless, we're ignored, but we were here, and we made things happen. And so in a lot of what Yvette and I are trying to do in this exhibit is to kind of give voice to that in some way. So I'll come back to this in a minute. So once you started to have you had, in this case, Mennonite farmers or Mennonite businessmen who basically provided permanent year-round employment. It was also, and Victor Weaver was one of the first. This was the chicken, essentially, disassembly line or the processing plant. So this was one way that people could kind of start to kind of make their foray from agriculture to food processing and then either into industry, services, or other kinds of jobs. One of the things that we incorporated in the exhibit was Frank Espada, who was a Puerto Rican photographer who took photographs. There aren't many photographs that are available of Puerto Ricans in the Pennsylvania countryside. This is one from Kennett Square over in Chester County. This is when growing mushrooms, and then this is at a period where the mushroom industry was basically relying on Puerto Ricans. Now they kind of, in the 70s, it sort of shifted over, 70s and 80s, to Mexican. But here you see basically women working in a kind of non-traditional way. The wife of this Puerto Rican migrant is kind of a Pennsylvania native. She described herself as a hillbilly, so I sort of find that interesting. You sort of arguably see the Dutchirican thing already starting to emerge. And then Espada is kind of seen, right, he's taking some pictures as people become being trained to be welders. And this is, I can't give you any pictures of people working in heavy industry, but in the 60s and early 70s, the Puerto Rican community is very small in Lebanon and Berks County, but it would be heavily male, or at least, I'm sorry, heavily in heavy industry. So again, housing that Espada found is that this is a guy who's being evicted from company housing, and you sort of see it's a great photograph and a kind of terrible moment. So what some of you are probably wondering about, I know at least Kate is wondering about, is just these are the just what are these Puerto Rican Mennonites, and I guess in some ways we're just here to say that there is this tradition that's going on. It's not super large, but it's a significant part of the Mennonite tradition. It's in the country, the fastest growing population are Latino and African Americans. And in this part of the world, there's about a dozen or so churches spread over central Pennsylvania and to certain parts of the New Jersey and Delaware and Maryland. So that seed started really in an event, we'll talk more about this, in Ay Bonito or La Plata in the center part of Puerto Rico, in a period where people were desperately poor and then kind of came over. But to leave that aside, these are just some of the faces of the people who built the Puerto Rican church in this area. And again, coming back to the theme that I talked about before with Shirley Bell, there's different interpretations of this. And there's not a huge amount of literature on it, but there's some, and so a lot of it is within the Mennonite church. And so as Shirley Bell presented this as, these are very pious Mennonites making their home available, they see this as God's work. Merle Good said basically the reason why farmers were like to recruit Puerto Ricans is they work really cheap. And if it wouldn't be for them, we'd never be able to do such a big operation. And he says, but they're always giving us trouble. They like to drink. So we give them Saturdays off. If we gave them Saturdays off, they'd just get drunk. So Rufus got a Spanish evangelist in here last summer, and that really changed things. A lot of them were converted, and they don't give us that kind of trouble anymore. In other words, they don't drink. And even help them start their church down the way. So this is, again, this kind of tension that Merle Good is talking about is there. There's certainly, it's one thing to kind of join the Mennonite church, that's good, but don't try to marry our daughters. And that period is kind of, is there, but has kind of been transformed, I guess, to some extent, or certainly to a large extent. So these are just pictures of the kind of process of, in this case, this is Miriam Gonzalez, who's the daughter of the first first Puerto Rican pastor who works at Victor Weaver's, right? He works all day kind of sharpening knives. He steals knives, which just means he sharpens them. As she told somebody, he steals knives all day, and on the weekends he goes to prison, which is kind of literally true in that he sharpened knives all day, and on the weekends he was a pastor and he did outreach to the prison. So basically, but she did this for comedic or dramatic effect, and of course when he found out about it, he was very strict, and that was the only time she was able to say it. So, but you could see that she grew up kind of in a conservative, conservative church. She became a single mom, which is, again, something that can talk about, but she's very proud that her son has become, essentially, to look at him, you would not know that he's Puerto Rican or has a Puerto Rican heritage, and he is a DA. So for somebody who kind of has this start as an outsider, even as an outsider within the Anabaptist tradition, she's very proud of kind of making it in the U.S. So again, this idea of struggling for memory is one that we've really kind of wrestled around with. Like, how do you, I can tell you this, but then how do you make sense out of it, or how do you do it? And how do you put that into some kind of coherent history that makes sense? So what we did is we have a exhibit that is we did at Lancaster Mennonite Historical Society that we're going to do at LBC, and so we're basically calling it Dutchirican, which is a Latino history, just a way of saying it's not the only thing going on, but it's one thread of this story. And so we pay attention to this kind of the tradition of the tomateros, because that's an important way that people are brought in. We also look at the Fresh Air program a little bit. I don't know if you all are familiar with the Fresh Air. It's one of these 19th century reform movements that I think the New York Herald did. You want to get kids out of the city into the countryside. And so Mennonite farmers were one of the people who participated in this program. It's essentially like they weren't allowed to have as much contact with the outside world, so this is one way that they could safely bring the outside world to them. So there's a kind of, it's an interesting symbiotic process. So Vicky Martinez, this is the account, which I can't read to you, but so for many of these farmers or Mennonite families, this was their first contact with Puerto Ricans or people of color, right? And they kind of dropped the color bar in the 50s or in the early 60s. So Vicky Martinez came, and this, the woman who's talking about it, whose first name I can't remember, but last name is Showalter, she describes it as Vicky was this like literally breath of fresh air. She was the first person who ever came in who had like colorful clothes and smells, different smells. So she said she always smelled like these just exotic smells like coriander or lavender. And so one of the kind of great stories is they really wanted her to go to church, and she wanted to be a good girl, but she was a good Catholic girl, and so she went to church, and she put a piece of tissue paper over her head like the Mennonites did, and then tissue paper in her ears. So everyone on both sides was really excited, and so Vicky was kind of like this other way that people are interacting. And then this is, Yvette will talk more about this, but this is something that we pulled together with our designer to basically talk about the way that this is becoming part of the Mennonite tradition. And that the women were really central to this. So this is actually the family in Faith House. These are kind of other families that kind of get started, and you've seen Miriam before. And then as well, we deal with different kinds of traditions. Like in this case, it's the Virgin of Guadalupe, which is the patron saint of Mexico. And then these are pictures that Yvette took at the celebration of the Virgin's appearance in Mexico. And then the last one, this is kind of a work in progress, but it gives you some idea. Part of what we're doing is just trying to document that people are here. We've done this work, and I'm sorry this doesn't come out very well, but you see basically a family, and then here it's a Mexican guy who's I'm sorry? Yeah, he's a mariachi, and he's super proud. He's working hard, saving his money, and he has everything except the hat. You can't quite see it because just the quality of the depiction. So he's working on the hat. But it's just a way of we're working with this young lady who's from El Salvador, who's a dreamer, and we're just trying to it's a way of saying this is a work in progress. So in some ways I will just say it's as a historian, I'm very aware that every community is an imagined community, and that to some extent we are making it up. We're not really making it up. There's lots of facts and all of that, but it's one interpretation, and I could go into more detail on that, but I think I will stop and turn it over to my lovely wife, who will talk about something else, something better.
Is it working? You can hear me? Okay. So I guess I'm going to cover some information, some of, let's call them gaps that maybe John did not mention. First, I wanted to say thank you for being here today, all of you. You can hear me. You're going like this, so, I don't know how to, just put this closer to my mouth. Okay. Is that better? See? Okay. So thank you for being here today, all of you, and especially, I guess, the Taller Puertorriqueño dice, el corazón dice cultural del barrio. Me encanta. I love how that sounds because I am from Caguas, which is the el corazón, dice en el nuevo país, sí, y el corazón de Puerto Rico. So I am from the heart of Puerto Rico. That's where I come from, in Caguas. And the way that John and I started working together, well, yes, we're married, but it sort of happened by chance. We both teach at Lebanon Valley College, and I had started, I teach Spanish. I am not the historian, so he's the one who you direct questions to. And I teach Spanish at Lebanon Valley College, and I had started doing interviews with my students. The college, I don't know if you're familiar with the area, but it's in Annville, Pennsylvania, and maybe 5, maybe 8 minutes from Annville is Lebanon, and Lebanon has notorious or big, evident Latino community. And I still don't understand why the connection between the college and that community is not evident. So I had started to take students out to the community to do some interviews in Spanish. Is this okay? Okay. To do some interviews in Spanish, and that's how I started working with this. And then I started listening to very interesting stories. I want to make sure that I don't talk too long. Very interesting stories, and I didn't know that those stories could be something else, that I didn't know that those stories mattered. For a historian, they matter maybe in a different way. So we started collecting some of those interviews, some in English, some in Spanish. You're going to hear me talk about Latinos, Puerto Ricans, Dutchiricans, all these identities. I'm going to navigate through them. But I guess the common ground is that idea from Pedro Ventura, who inscribed on the wall where he used to live, and John showed you the image. Is like that idea of leaving a mark, of leaving a footprint, if you want to call it that, and being heard. We are here, and we matter, basically. So what I'm going to do is, you see that I am going to use parts of a couple of presentations I've already done, so hang in there with me. I'm going to give you some background information about our work together, and some more specific examples of the narrative, or examples about those interviews that I already mentioned. And then I'm going to give you more details about our project that we titled Dutchirican, and some examples of my own photography. Unfortunately, this doesn't work. This project gave us the opportunity to meet lots of interesting people and discover and revisit places. And you notice John started the story from the Pennsylvania viewpoint, and I am going to start it sort of from the Puerto Rican side. So yes, we went back to Ay Bonito, which is sort of in the central mountainous area in the island. And this was the summer of 2015. We were led by my parents' neighbor, because that's the way sometimes you do, you work things out in Puerto Rico. If you know someone who knows someone, you might get to the information more easily. So my parents' neighbor, Don Miguel Merli, who now lives in Caguas, he's originally from Ay Bonito. He's like, oh, I'll take you there. You want to know more about the Mennonite history? You want to know more what they did in Puerto Rico? I'll take you there. So he volunteered to show us how the Mennonites had, as he exclaimed, woken up the whole island back in 1943. The hospital in Ay Bonito, see? I don't know, the hospital.
The one on the right.
Okay. The hospital in Ay Bonito, thank you. proudly displays photographs of those days in the lobby, and as we were studying them, Don Jose El Gallero, that's the one name he gave us, and that's all we know about him, unfortunately. Don Jose El Gallero, I don't know how to say gallero in English.
He's like a rooster fighter,
I guess. Don Jose El Gallero stopped by and identified his younger brother, that's what he said, as one of those sick babies that the Mennonites' care and attention led back to health. Photography was an important part of the Mennonite endeavor. There is a book by Livia Gonzalez Lopez that clearly illustrates this important endeavor, but absent from narrative, I believe, it tells only part of the story. So you might see the nurses taking care of impoverished kids, but if you know the story of the nurse, of the story about this child, it might be more significant. In 1943, a group of Mennonites from Lancaster went to the island of Puerto Rico to do service work as conscientious objectors of World War II. Nowadays, both on the island and in Pennsylvania, there are schools, hospitals, churches with services both in English and in Spanish. Even though the Mennonite Church is recognized by its German roots, many now include Latino members. Mennonites are known as part of the Dutch culture, John already mentioned that defines the central PA region, where Latinos are perceived as outsiders, but part of a group that is quickly growing. The interviews and photographs that we have worked on exemplify what anthropologist Jorge Duani affirms, that Puerto Rico is a nation on the move. Some interviewees were born in places like Utuado or Ay Bonito, others in the US with a parent who came to work in the fields in the 40s and 50s. The Tomateros, for instance, was a group of, and hanging there with me, 427,604 that, according to Jorge Duani, were recruited between 1947 and 1990 and was the second largest workers program after the Mexican braceros. This is how Jorge Duani describes them: anonymous pioneros de la diáspora boricua, or anonymous pioneers of the Puerto Rican diaspora, are proof that the roots of the contemporary exodus was initiated with a massive displacement of rural workers. They traveled to many states, but concentrated in the Northeast, especially in New Jersey, Connecticut, New York, Delaware, Massachusetts, and Pennsylvania. What is more interesting to me is that many of them did not travel alone. So I'm more interested in sort of studying the difference in gender and sort of trying to look at this history from the women's perspective. The quotes that I included there, which you probably already read, are from that Puerto Rican pastor that John mentioned, Don Jorge Gonzalez. And what I think is really interesting about him, not only his life and his family history, but he had the privilege, so he put out his face for others, and he would question the other, I guess, from the United States, the Mennonites that already lived there. He questioned the living conditions that they had of some of the Puerto Rican workers that John asked you, and it's very interesting to see how Don Jorge's sort of philosophy and view of life affected everyone sort of in his community and also in his family. I don't know what I'm doing. Okay, that's Don Jorge. A Puerto Rican jíbaro, which is someone from the countryside, from La Plata in Ay Bonito, becomes a Mennonite pastor in Pennsylvania. The pictures are not great, but obviously when these Puerto Rican people come to the U.S., we all bring our culture with us, and there he is making his lechon, his pork, obviously in Ay Bonito, you see the mountains in the background, and then also in Pennsylvania on the right. Helen Safa notes that during Operation Bootstrap, which was the 1940s government-led initiative to industrialize Puerto Rico and also relocate part of the population, more women than men were employed in the service and manufacturing jobs. Some of them, maybe following a spouse who found a job abroad, decided to migrate to the United States. The women I talked to, mostly daughters of that generation, identified common values like the close-knit family, the hard work ethic, and the high value of motherhood. This came up again and again in most of those interviews. Even though these are common values, they could be sources of tension in some cases, and this is one example. A mixture of diverse people could not have been all positive and smooth. Nevertheless, and apart from the personal stories, the Mennonite collection of photographs studied by Livia Gonzalez Lopez documents how work, service, community, agriculture, and the Puerto Rican landscape was quickly changing. A lot of those pictures, some of everyday life, were taken by women. And here's an image of all of the Mennonite women dressed in the same way. A lot of those pictures were taken by women. Many Mennonite boys in Puerto Rico and in the US turned the camera to other women and their families. In these everyday occurrences, we now find history. We can also see that in some other images that we found, these are people who just decide to share their personal narratives, and they open their family album when they are being interviewed. And you can see how cultural practices, or what Duane would call transnational practices, which is when you, like I mentioned earlier, you migrate, but with you bring some of your culture, and you continue to practice some of that culture in the new place. So some of those transnational practices include playing certain types of music and using certain instruments. The guitar is there. I don't know if it's very obvious. It's coming up. The guiro, maracas, el cuatro, which are all examples of Puerto Rican instruments. Practicing baseball, eating home-cooked meals, Puerto Rican style, etc., etc. So all those are evident in these family albums. Ramonita's father was an example of a tomatero John talked about, and he came to work in the fields, and then when he was able to, he left his family in Puerto Rico, and then they came to join him here. And it's interesting to see, like, there's some images, very traditional images of family, yet sort of like I said, the Mennonite women, they all shared, for example, a common value was a really high value of motherhood. But when motherhood became practiced in a different way, like in the case of the single mother, then things start to tense up and things start to become problematic. At the same time, you see the house. I think John talked about the chicken house, where this specific family used to be in the lower picture, and on the top you see where the Mennonite farmers that housed them would live. And it's interesting because when I talked to Ramonita, she said that when she, as an adult, she had left that house for many years, and as an adult, she went back to visit the house. And when she goes in, she said, I didn't realize how small it was. Obviously, when she was a little girl, she didn't notice, but then as an adult, you do notice those differences. This is more information about the women workers. Women came to work in every, and I have something around here, in every field. Some of them also worked in agriculture, in factories, as well as working in kitchens to provide for the families or to support the churches and the families. So again, you can still look at this history and then sort of shift it and focus on the women's work, which is what we're trying to do. And then, like I said, I had two different sub-themes that I was going to talk about. The second part is, I call it Caras de Lebanon, the faces of Lebanon. Again, in my desire to sort of link together somehow the community that I see in Anvil and the Hispanic community that I see in Lebanon, which is really close by. As I was doing those interviews, we got this idea and we thought, okay, well, let's take some pictures of these people as we talk to them. And here you have some examples of my own photography, which are also part of this exhibition John mentioned that was in the Lancaster Historical Society, and now it opens in June 30, at Lebanon Valley College at the Art Gallery. So my own photographs came out of this project. Some of the ones shown here reflect on the Latino community in Lebanon. And notice, like I said, I'm navigating all these identities because when I talk about Latinos, I am obviously including there's people from El Salvador, Dominicans, Puerto Ricans, Mexicans, etc. Some of the interviews we made drew us to people like Don Jose Soto, who plays the cuatro. You see him, you know who he is. The Puerto Rican national instrument, every Sunday at St. Benedict's Church. Doña Rosario, is not there, but I'll show you a picture of her right now. Hold on, I'm going to the other side. Doña Chayo or Rosario is the woman who is making the cake, and it's interesting as a transnational practice. She wants to portray again the Mexican flag. And there's also a group of volunteers that include various nationalities make tamales to celebrate the Virgin of the Guadalupe or the Mexican patron saint on December 12th. It's a big celebration. Again, this is happening in Lebanon every December 12th. It's open to the public, and there is a beautiful display, again, mostly women who participate in this performance, mostly dancing and basically celebrating the Virgin of the Guadalupe. I want to go back because I really like the picture of the group of barbers. This is a mix of Dominicans and Puerto Ricans. Francisco Peña is the owner of the barber shop. He's Dominican. And they demonstrate the transnational practices of some Dominicans, very interesting, who would much rather own their own businesses than work from someone else. This is what they say, and this is what Jorge Duani's statistics also show. And then, like I said, I wanted to show all the differences between, not all, but I wanted to show differences between the Latino community as we continue to include more images on the exhibition. And you can see the woman in the middle, Liliana Sanchez. She has her own business at home. She's a seamstress. And then I think that's it. And then you can see there was another, now that some people know that I'm walking around taking pictures of them, the trick to get them to pose for you is, I always say, I want to portray the Latino community in a very dignified manner because I am very proud, and then that's it. They're all signing the release form and they all want their picture taken. And I think there is still that sort of that desire of like Pedro Ventura to say, we're here, this is who we are, don't get the wrong idea about us. We're here, we work, and like I said, we want to be portrayed with dignity. The one image on the right was obviously a girl's birthday party, and now that they know that I take pictures of them, I get invited to weddings and to birthday parties. And it's interesting because as a transnational practice, The piñata is very well known in the Mexican community, yet if you see Peppa Pig, is a cartoon the kids watch in the United States. I'm not very familiar with Peppa Pig, but I've seen her before, and there she was. And like I said, one of my favorites is the Virgin de Guadalupe, and there you have some of the images. And again, as a transnational practice, the music, the food after the event, typically Mexican, the dance also, and the dresses are, I just show you the picture of the seamstress. So she makes the dresses, and some of them, like the detail on the right, those are brought directly from Mexico, because again, it's this pride to sort of show off your own culture. And I think that's it. Thank you. Should I leave it there? And then John?
We're going to have all the questions for you.
So questions or comments, we are open to ideas if you have any, or suggestions. Stop. And John needs to stand up. Should I turn this on?
You guys, or I think John earlier on in the presentation mentioned that a lot of the collaborative, like the Mennonites and the Puerto Ricans were people to stay with. It was almost as a means of assimilation, because maybe the people from Pennsylvania didn't understand or like appreciate the way that Puerto Ricans were behaving or something like that. So it was a means of assimilation, but what impact does it have now on the community? Like, is it a very integrated community between the Latino communities and the Pennsylvanians? Like, how is that seen now?
It is mixed. It's varied. I mean, so Pennsylvania, the level of residential segregation, or there's a, it is pretty high. It's basically on par, or in some cases more than black-white segregation. So that's a reality, right? You mainly have urban or kind of small city populations that are, you know, the barrio of Lancaster County. But there is this other tradition, and that's part of what we wanted to point to, that it's, that I guess I would say that our bias through the media is towards conflict. And that's understandable, right? And it's real, and it exists. But that this kind of tradition also is real. It also exists. And so it's one of the other things that's kind of moving through the community. So I don't know whether you want to call it assimilation, but it's definitely change, right? And so there's a power, conflict, and kind of hatred, you could even say, is a real force, but so is love. And that part of what you would say, I know that people like Jorge Duane and others would say, there's not so much assimilation, but there's definitely some kind of intermixing of the cultures, right? And so you see that going on, and that's what this, so one of the things that's most notable about Puerto Ricans, for people who don't have independence, they have a very strong tradition of identifying as Puerto Rican, even into the second or third generation. So we have friends of ours that live down the street from the college. Her grandparent, or this one guy's, you know, he's to look at him, he would think, oh, David Miller, he's your classic Dutchy kid, right? He went to Liberty University. He's an evangelical minister, youth minister, but he identifies as Puerto Rican. He's a proud Puerto Rican because that's where his grandparents are from, and that's where his mom is like this Nuyorican. And so, again, so in one sense, does he speak Spanish? No. Has he ever really been to the island? No. But that doesn't matter, right? That's also part of the Puerto Rican tradition. So it's just so I don't mean to dodge your question, but it's, the area is going to change. And you see this happening in other areas more clearly, like in western Kansas. Western Kansas has been in demographic decline for decades, and to the extent it's not anymore, it's largely because Mexicans have moved into the area, and there is this period of kind of tension. People intermarry, and then and now in like a lot of these small towns, the kind of one night a week they'll have foreign food, which is like meatloaf, right? So, and so people basically make their peace with it, and I think a generation or two from now, people will look back at some of this and say, oh, what were they thinking? Because so it'll just be, it'll be as American as habichuelas, right?
Can I add something? I think it for me it was really interesting to see, like I said, the history like from the other side, because the way that the Puerto Ricans seem to be portrayed, most of the descriptions that John made are very different to, if you go back to Ay Bonito like we did, and I did talk to some of the women who might have been daughters of people that were there years ago, when that first daughters or granddaughters of that sort of first encounter, if you want to call it that. Very different story. People are very proud of the legacy that the Mennonites left in Ay Bonito. The hospital is beautiful. You walk through it, and those images are right there in the lobby. That man just went and talked to me out of the blue, because people know the history is displayed as you walk in. John showed, and I did show too, that big banner, and basically traces that history. So it's very different when you see it from one side of the spectrum and the other. And in Puerto Rican history, which I am not an expert, but I know about 1898, if you think about when the United States invaded Puerto Rico, and you think sort of those relationships, what happens in 1943 is very different. These are people who want to volunteer, who don't want to fight, and that's why they went to Puerto Rico, and they live, their neighbors, they collaborate in the hospital. There's images of them like making a hole to dig the ground, I guess, to build the hospital together, and that comes out as a very, very different sort of view of each other, and I think it's very interesting, and it comes out a lot in the photographs. So I guess depends where you put your perspective.
Is there any studies on the impact economically that this community has in that area of PA? We have Dominicans, and we're very common when we come to the city. We start workers, our goal is to be on the ball.
Right.
Yes.
Lancaster's an example.
Yes.
There's a great migration of Dominicans that came from New York, and right now they go to Lancaster, and they have real estate,
Mm-hmm.
they have their doctors, their lawyers, and their owners. So for this community, what is the economic impact of the Puerto Ricans from that generation has contributed to this part of PA? Is there any documentary, any type of...
That is a great question, and the answer, as far as I can tell, is no. But it's a great,
But you said that what you mentioned about the Dominicans, we noticed, yeah.
Right.
We read about it, and then, yes.
So-
Oh, yeah, yes.
We are collecting information
Uh-huh.
in that
Right.
So with the Puerto Ricans, what we noticed when we came in, the Puerto Ricans were the ones that had the first shop.
Right.
The ones who were guiding us.
Right.
So I would think that's why
Oh, sweet.
we're trying to hide it.
Uh-huh.
I think it's a useful, one of the things, like for one of our former students, really my student, is now, he's the director of Hazelton's Community Development Bank. And so Can Do is what they call it up there. And so part of what I was saying is like, so that's a town where if it wasn't for Dominicans, the population would be close to, would be a long since declined. So demographically, almost all of the population growth in Pennsylvania as a whole is Puerto Rican, Dominican, Mexican. So I mean, so no one studied the economic impact, but that's right, piggybacking.
Right.
But I think, but I know the Dominican Republic has a much stronger sense that its diasporic population is linked to its island's health. So, so for instance, as my student is interested in trying to develop Hazleton, so I'm encouraging him to say, basically, you need to talk to the Dominican government to basically as a way to see that, because the more you build up that population, the more you build up that city, you're building up the, the country as a whole, right? So they have a different concept. So I would say Pennsylvania, at least in that regard, is kind of behind that curve.
But I'm glad you point that out because I think it's important to remember, like if we say Dutchirican or Latino or whatever, there are differences even among Cubans, Dominicans, and Puerto Ricans, and that is a striking difference that we saw, and it came out in the interview after interview. They'd be like, no, we want to be our own boss. We want to own like the restaurant. We want to own the whatever, and it's right there. It's like evident. So it's just interesting to sort of keep in mind that, yeah, we share language and we share a common culture in some ways, but there are differences. Nick has a question.
So it's fascinating that you have sort of the prototypical Dutchy Mennonite group, and then the tide that's going both directions during this period of time.
Right.
But, and I'd be really interested to do similar tracks with the evangelicals and the Mexican Catholics to see what that is as a path to both sort of landing and then also just some form of assimilation.
Right.
But isn't it really paradoxical that the Mennonites, who are an enclave, anti-assimilation community, in a sense, are the vehicle?
Mm-hmm.
That's a great question. I think, and I know there is one study that is an anthropologist did that was looking at these Mennonite churches and the kind of tensions, and a lot of it was just, you're talking about people who are, especially in really rural areas, who are just physically, socially isolated, because they're working on farms or in small rural areas and they don't speak the language. They don't know anything really about the area, and so in that sense, yeah, the church becomes the vehicle of just of some basic fundamental social interaction, if not assimilation. No, that's a great.
Well, it seems like there are a whole bunch of possible explanations. Like, well, great, you've got these workers. We don't want them in town, but it's okay if they live with the Mennonites.
Yeah, sort of. Yeah.
Or Mennonites or have are true to their faith, and they're like, okay, we have to be decent here.
The Mennonites it's a kind of a bunch of accidents, because in the Mennonite church history they start becoming way more evangelical in the 50s. They start in the 20s doing outreach, but in the 50s they kind of get the call, and so there's a period where they are really just reaching out. There's a period where El Buen Pastor, the Good Shepherd Church, tries to get a start in North Philly, and it doesn't go real well, partly because it's just such a different. I read an account where they were saying, yeah, these are just like these are country people that are coming, and they don't get kind of how North Philly works. So yeah, that didn't work. But so it's just a way of saying there's all different kinds of ways that people are coming there, and it's not this kind of old-fashioned notion of almost like steam-powered idea of like you build a factory or dig a mine, and that is how a lot of Pennsylvania's diversity came about, but it's not what's happening now, right? And it doesn't explain the present, so we just have to be more open. I'm sorry, there are a couple more questions.
Mine was really just about the exit. I just wanted to catch that. You said June 30th?
June 30th
Yes.
is the opening.
It's in Lebanon Valley College, and what?
Which is in beautiful downtown Annville, which is right next to Cleona. It's between Cleona and Palmyra. I'm just kidding. I'm just
Is-
no. These are no. We'll get
There's
your
only one
information.
street
We'll
in
make sure that
Anvil,
you'll-
so you'll find it.
But we'd love to have you come out.
Normally, when cultures interact, there's a fusion of, some things, traditions or ways. Is there a lot of evidence of what Puerto Ricans were able to bring and change in the Mennonite community? Or just, did they adopt some of the dishes or
Yeah.
perhaps ceremonial events?
We've been, like, the first example that comes to my mind is El Buen Pastor in Lancaster, and we went to one of their services, and they sing and danced in English and Spanish, and the pastor is obviously Puerto Rican, Juan Gonzalez. And Juan Gonzalez, when we opened the Dutchirican exhibit in Lancaster, he wrote a decima, which is like the traditional folk songs from the Jibaros in the mountains. And his decima narrates, is a beautiful thing, and narrates the story of like the Puerto Ricans who were working in the fields in the 40s, and the Mennonites came and they worked together, and then this other migrated to the United States, and sort of the tensions in the, so basically narrating the whole history that we're trying to sort of document. So that would be one example. And I remember in El Buen Pastor, after one of the services, we had arroz con pollo, habichuelas, tostones. So the food definitely has been incorporated, and some of their services are completely in Spanish, right?
Yeah.
Another example is like in the case of the Catholic Church, that's where you saw the guy with the cuatro. So you see that in some areas they start to sort of insert their own culture. And this is the St. Benedict's in this Catholic Church in Lebanon. It's the same one where they have the Virgin of Guadalupe. So there's a lot of Mexicans, a lot of Dominicans, Puerto Ricans, and they sort of live together. What else?
I think sometimes too, there's just like, and I guess I'll speak about more the Dutchy, even though I'm not Pennsylvania Dutch. I can't even fake it. But the guy who did, for instance, who printed all of our stuff, he, very nice guy, and we're talking. He's got Fox News playing the whole time, and then later he says, it turns out my granddaughter is
a
Puerto
Dutchirican.
But he says, I don't want to call her a Dutchirican because that's like, he thinks that's like an insult. But
Not everybody likes
so I
the
think there's
term.
a lot of, there's a lot of different ways of interacting, and one of them is just there's like a silence or almost like an embarrassed silence, because it's a very funny community, very insular and inward looking, and they have lots of peculiar notions about how things should be done. But he also said, in terms of assimilation, he said she asked him, she goes, Granddad, if I'm Puerto Rican, how come I can't speak Spanish? She's like, well, so he's having to explain how it's not really, language isn't genetic. So.
Did they introduce any, did they do anything else besides the hospital, and is it ever used?
In Ay Bonito, yeah, there's hospitals, some schools, and they also have some of the churches, and it's interesting because most of the pastors that I've seen in the U.S. were men. Over there, big difference. Most of them are the women, and they still keep just that tradition, and like they might go to conferences here and there. So the relationship is still ongoing. It has changed, obviously. I don't think they're doing as much agriculture, but the relationship is still functioning in one way or the other. Very interesting.
I don't know if you're familiar with the tradition of 10,000 villages. This kind of fair trade. So there is, I don't know whether it's true or not, but there's an argument that it starts with Puerto Rico, because this is one of the first international missions that Puerto Ricans start doing. There's 800 people that went there, and at the time that they came, Puerto Rico was really, really poor, and there was a tradition of women doing needlework to make money, and so some of that was sold in the U.S., which became essentially kind of morphed 10,000 villages. So, I mean, so in terms of those interactions, that's why the Lancaster Mennonite Historical Society is keen to kind of document that and just kind of claim their place within the Mennonite church to basically say, this is our history, we were there, you know, we're part of the tradition, we're part of the Anabaptist tradition, as well as being Puerto Rican or Mexican or Dominican and everything.
I'm the director of the Lancaster Historical Society. It's
from
Puerto
La Plata,
Rican. It's
yeah.
from La Plata y Bonito. So it's, like I said, there's just many ways in which you see that interaction still happening.
So thanks so much.
Thank
everyone,
you for
coming.
like hanging in there all the time.